Hello and thank you for joining me for some more Legend of Nobunaga. This week we're facing an extremely difficult battle actually, the clash at Fuji, facing the Hojo clan alongside our allies, the Tokugawa, whereas the Hojo have pulled two clans to help them out, the Date and the Sanada as said here on the battle map. And both of them are going to prove fairly interesting allies to the Hojo clan. So let's get in there. Later I'll be comparing this battle to the siege of Odawara castle, but for now let's see what the legend has.
Alright, we have our goal. We shall be moving soon. Sir!
Odawara castle was the final battle of the Sengoku Jidai's initial conflict between the clans and the beginning of an external conflict. But for now let's see what's happening with Tokugawa over at Mount Fuji.
What? Lord Oda?
We must return to Mikawa!
My lord, is it not time for you to plot your own course?
That is not me. If Lord Nobunaga was born to be a hunting falcon, I was born to be a seabird bound to the shore. But? Once only, I flew with him. I remember. It felt good.
Then, isn't it time to fly again?
Ieyasu, you seem strangely happy for some reason.
If Lord Nobunaga had truly died at Honnoji, I had decided. In your stead, I was prepared to conquer the land.
You were?
Yes. However, I am here, and you live. I have chosen. Let us fight for peace.
So the game's hinting at the fact that Ieyasu Tokugawa would historically take over the land in the wake of Nobunaga, and in fact in the wake of Hideyoshi. But instead Nobunaga lives and Ieyasu,
let us begin.
Remains subservient.
According to the scouts, this is what we face.
So, let's have a look at what sort of stage we have this week. As I said, it's a fairly difficult one, but from the map you couldn't really tell.
We shall win if we defeat the leader of the eastern daimyo, Ujimasa Hojo. Ieyasu Tokugawa is here. The enemy commander, Ujimasa Hojo, has positioned his forces here. We must somehow get safely across the river.
Much easier said than done, as I'll soon find out.
Lord Nobunaga, let us defeat Hojo. Let us defeat the old order together.
My lord, it is time to deploy.
So we move into the deployment phase. For this battle, you split your forces between an east and west wing on either side of the river. Your east wing is supported by Ieyasu, and the east wing has a much harder time during the battle, so I guess that's why they gave you Ieyasu support. Over on the west, there aren't too many enemy units to face. It's actually the Date army on the west, the Date being a separate clan to the Hojo. This battle is essentially against a coalition of clans, the Hojo, the Sanada and the Date. And the Date are going to play a special role in this battle that actually links into some of the events at the siege of Odawara castle, which is the battle I'm going to be comparing this battle to later on. But before I get to that story, which actually takes place 8 years after this battle, I'm going to need to fill you in on a few details of the battle between Hideyoshi and Tokugawa.
Impressive! Victory is as good as ours!
Which I hinted at last week.
Alright, let's move out. Remember, we fight for the land and for peace! Sir!
So we head into the stage. I'll try and give a little commentary on my fighting too.
Do not leave any regrets behind! Follow me!
I begin the stage simply advancing. There's a note right in front of you where you start which tells you to use a dam to lower the water. So the first stage of this battle is moving towards the dam in the southern central area of the map. in order to do that. Here's the note now.
Wait a minute there, young fellow. There's something I want to tell you.
So as I said, I'm going to be comparing this to the siege of Odawara Castle. This took place in 1590, when Hojo is defeated by Hideyoshi in a huge siege battle, which basically led to the unification of Japan and the end of the second stage of the Sengoku Jidai era. You can divide it loosely up into stages of Nobunaga stage, the Hideyoshi stage, and the Ieyasu stage, each one bringing Japan closer to unification, and Ieyasu Tokugawa being the one to finally realize it. But this takes place 8 years in the future, as I said, so first I'm going to detail a little story about Hideyoshi's conflict with Ieyasu Tokugawa, and conclude the story I was telling last week of the wars for succession after Nobunaga's historical death. Last time I mentioned that Hideyoshi had just defeated Katsuie Shibata and become the de facto ruler of the Oda clan. He placed his favourite heir, Samboshi, in the position of the ruler of the Oda clan, ruling from Gifu Castle. Meanwhile, he himself was the de facto ruler, using Samboshi as a puppet. Basically, by this stage, the Oda clan had become Hideyoshi's personal clan. Now here in the stage we can see two things going on. First is contact with Yukimori Sanada, the son of the Sanada officer we were fighting last time we saw the Sanada clan, which was during the pacification of Kai province a couple of episodes back. Now this is not the first time we're going to be seeing this enemy officer, because like the Sanada officers we've seen in the past, they can magically regenerate themselves and keep reappearing throughout the course of the battle. The second thing is that I'm being bombarded by cannon fire. And this is going to be a key aspect in the battle that is going to gradually be decimating my forces, slowly but surely, until I have very little left at the end. These cannonade fire comes down throughout the entire northern half of the map, which means you can't really make any forward progress without being hit by it. And because the enemy units are immune to the fire, when you stop to fight enemy units, you're basically taking constant damage and having the formations broken up by this cannon fire. So this is going to prove extremely difficult to deal with a little bit later on. So back to the War of Succession. It seemed like the War of Succession was over once Hideyoshi had defeated Katsuie, but in fact there was another contender for leadership, and in 1584 he emerged. His name was Oda Nobu, who was basically the ruler of Owari province and one of Nobunaga's less esteemed sons. He became important because he gained the support of Ieyasu Tokugawa in 1584, which meant now he had the strong military basis to challenge Hideyoshi and try and make himself the legitimate ruler of Oda. Since he was closer to Nobunaga's direct line than Samboshi was, he still had some level of legitimacy.
Let no one
To Hideyoshi, it seemed like Tokugawa would have to be punished for supporting his rival in this war for succession, so he began to prepare an army to invade Owari province, where Tokugawa's forces were gathering in support of Nobuo, and basically he planned to destroy him and make sure he kept his hegemony over the Oda forces. But before Hideyoshi could even finish preparing his army, the fighting already broke out when one of his retainers in Mino gathered up an army of 5,000 troops and invaded Owari from the north, capturing a key set of Nobuo's retainer castles, weakening his military position. However, Tokugawa's army soon appeared and pushed him back to Mino. So Owari was now fortified and able to challenge Hideyoshi's army with the huge Tokugawa force waiting around for something to happen. Hideyoshi finally finished preparing his army, which could have been as large as 100,000 troops, one of the largest armies in the Sengoku Jidai era, and marched it into Owari province. Tokugawa took up a defensive position at a place called Komaki and started to face off with Hideyoshi's army, but neither side really engaged each other, at least at first, because both had separate reasons for not wanting to force engagement. The Tokugawa troops were kind of scared of Hideyoshi's army, both because of its large size, its large amount of experience, but more so because it contained a large fraction of firearm troops, and Ieyasu Tokugawa, who was present at the Battle of Nagashino, could clearly remember how effective firearm troops were at destroying large armies and taking relatively little casualties. So he was worried about staging an assault on Hideyoshi's position. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, Hideyoshi didn't really want to assault the Tokugawa position, because he knew that he was already in the dominant position. He only had things to lose by entering battle, nothing to gain. So he was free to just wait and see what Tokugawa did. Basically just waiting patiently for some sort of resolution to the conflict to happen. However, his patience would prove not to be infinite, because in the end he decided to hatch a plan whereby he would force the Tokugawa army to move by using a decoy attack on one of the minor Tokugawa forts in the area to draw his forces away, and then attack whilst they were split up, hopefully using sheer force of numbers to put enough pressure on Tokugawa's forces that he would surrender, and they could come to some sort of arrangement, an arrangement that stopped Nobuo from becoming the next heir to the Oda clan.
This is our...
Unfortunately for Hideyoshi, this plan was doomed to fail, because informants in Hideyoshi's camp gave away the plan to Ieyasu Tokugawa. He knew that a decoy army would be marching towards one of his other forts, and was able to set up an ambush force waiting for them. This ambush was extremely effective and destroyed Hideyoshi's detached force, killing several of Hideyoshi's key generals in the process. So now the Hideyoshi army was severely weakened, and they no longer had the strength to engage with the Tokugawa army, and were forced to fall back from the engagement completely. So although a decisive battle wasn't fought, Tokugawa managed to hang on, and Nobuo's claim to the throne remained. But Hideyoshi knew he couldn't leave things like this, so he hatched a new plan which was not too dissimilar to the plan he used against Katsuie. Before I describe that plan, let's have a look at what's going on in the stage. Nobunaga has just found an item in this little nook and cranny. Meanwhile, I've been fighting my way south towards the dam, defeating all the enemy units in the river to the north, not with any help from those cannons that kept coming down. Meanwhile, Toshie and Musashi have moved up towards the Date position. The Date clan are positioned behind a set of palisades, and most of their units were firearms, so I didn't want to do a frontal assault, learning a lesson from Nagashino. Instead, I tried to flank them and found these Hojo forces waiting for me, and there's actually going to be a whole lot more than what I thought waiting for me. Meanwhile, back over towards the dam, Yukimura Sanada... Oh no, that's not Yukimura Sanada, it's a separate enemy reinforcement unit, shows up to attack me, ambushing me from the mountains. Luckily they won't prove too difficult to deal with for now. So I said that Hideyoshi hatched just a plan similar to the plan he used against Katsuie. His plan against Katsuie was simply to go and defeat Nobutaka, the heir to the throne that Katsuie was supporting, so that a lot of Katsuie's cause would be defeated because he no longer had an heir to be supporting. Well, he did exactly the same thing, faced with the Tokugawa threat. He began attacking the forces directly commanded by Nobuo and his various forces inside and outside Owari, capturing various castles belonging to him and generally weakening his economic strength personally. This very quickly led to Nobuo surrendering to Hideyoshi because he realized that he was going to face complete and utter personal destruction, have all his land stripped for him, and possibly forced to commit suicide if he didn't surrender very quickly. So he surrenders, and this means Ieyasu Tokugawa no longer has a cause to be fighting in Owari. There's nothing for him to do. And as Hideyoshi had hoped, Tokugawa forces fall back to Mikawa. This would be the end of Hideyoshi's conflict with Tokugawa for now. So it wasn't so much of a war, there was only a single semi-decisive engagement, but it's just interesting because the game in this level is portraying Tokugawa as unendingly loyal, abandoning his own ambition to support that of the Oda clan, whereas historically they were willing to go against at least the leading regime of the Oda clan in order to support their own interests. The War of Succession at that point was effectively over, and it left Hideyoshi in a position where he could start consolidating his power, receiving various imperial titles, and beginning to restructure the Oda clan to turn it into his own personal clan. Despite the fact that his choice of heir, Samboshi, was still the technical leader of the clan, almost nobody paid any attention to him though. Hideyoshi had military and economic control and was giving out land to his own personal retainers, meaning that the majority of the powerful men within the Oda domain were loyal to him rather than loyal to members of the Oda family. I've now defeated the ambush forces outside the dam, which means I'm going to be able to head over and start playing with the water level. This is going to unlock new routes for me across the river, and we're very soon going to see it's also going to unlock a whole bunch of new routes for the enemy, who are going to reveal that they have hidden forces. Toshie, meanwhile, has finally outflanked the Date army and is destroying the cannons that were supporting them. This stage was the first time in the game that I noticed cannons can actually fire diagonally. I always assumed that if you weren't directly in their arc of fire they couldn't hit you, but that turns out not to be the case, much to my chagrin in just a few minutes time. So here we go, the floodgates have been opened. For some reason opening these floodgates actually reduces the water level. I guess the river must have been flowing south or something, and this is going to unlock new pathways for us to move across the river. Nobunaga's forces are going to start moving northwards, where he is going to encounter Yukimura Sanada yet again. Actually in a very unfortunate engagement for me in terms of formations. We'll see that in a moment. Anyway, let's jump back into the story. I just finished with the end of the War of Succession, and now I'm going to jump 6 years into the future, when Hideyoshi is looking eastward towards the Hojo clan who we're seeing today in the game, who are the last clan still defiant of his rulership over Japan. Toshie, looking east, sees a massive Hojo army is moving across the newly opened river crossings, so I'm forced to abandon my attacks on the Date clan to deal with them. Meanwhile, we can see here Yukimura is rushing south towards Nobunaga. Ieyasu is in an interesting position, basically behind the enemy's rear flank now that they've turned to face west. So I'm going to use his forces to start attacking the Sanada main base in the center of the map. However, that main base is very well defended by cannon fire. Here we also see one of the things you should really try and avoid in the game, which is engaging with a melee unit whilst ranged units are engaging you from behind them. It means you can get very few attacks in, which means Toshie and Musashi are taking constant arrow fire, as you can see from the background. Luckily, because I was manually controlling them, I could make strategic use of blocking. These spearmen can somehow block arrows. And Musashi, under the AI, actually was very good at blocking as well, so I took very little damage, even though this would have been the classic deadly scenario for Kessen strategies. Anyway, Hideyoshi, indeed, is heading to defeat the Hojo clan. And you can get an idea of what happened in the 6 years since the end of the story I was just telling, just by looking at who was present in Hideyoshi's army 6 years later. We have some of the most important clans in Japan are now subservient to Hideyoshi. Clans like Uesugi, like the Chosokabe, the rulers of the Shikoku Island, one of Japan's main islands to the west, and of the Sanada clan, in fact, who are facing us today, and Tokugawa. So forces from these 4 clans make up Hideyoshi's initial campaign force, and on the way he was going to try and gain support from even more clans, particularly the Date clan, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And by this stage in history, Hideyoshi has taken complete control of the Oda clan into his own family, and it would probably be accurate to call the clan the Toyotomi clan, which was Hideyoshi's real family name. He changed his name from Hideyoshi Hashiba to Hideyoshi Toyotomi, but I'm still going to call him Hideyoshi Hashiba just because that's the name I'm used to, just as I was calling him that even before he took that name, back when he was Tokichiro Kinoshita at the beginning of the game. Anyway, a massive force under Hideyoshi converges on the Hojo lands. They have a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. So Hojo is in trouble, and you could ask, why did he even try to resist Hideyoshi at this stage? Because in this late stage in history in 1590, Hideyoshi is extremely powerful, far more powerful than the Oda clan is now. He controls basically all of Japan, encompassing a vast amount of territory, which we haven't even seen in the game so far because Nobunaga hasn't even come near to capturing those areas. But Hideyoshi would later go on to control them far to the west, all of the Mori lands, the Shimazu lands in Kyushu Island, the Chosokabe lands. So why was Hojo holding out? Well, perhaps it was just for personal reasons, because they really stood to lose almost nothing from just surrendering to Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was offering to let them just keep their lands, just be a vassal ruler. So basically nothing would change for them except for the fact that they had to pledge allegiance to Hideyoshi and possibly pay his shogunate some sort of tribute or taxes over time, but they chose not to go for this option and to resist Hideyoshi. So it was probably because they had issues of personal sovereignty. They didn't want to give up the rulership of the lands that they had historically held for nearly 100 years. And possibly it was an aspect of samurai honor as well, that they just did not want to surrender without even attempting to fight. Because the Hojo army, in fact, was massive. They had something like 80,000 troops. They were one of the great clans. They were far more powerful than the other clans at the time, like the Uesugi or the former Takeda, had been at war with both for a very long time, and basically never lost anything to them because of their very strong defensive abilities. And it was these defensive abilities that they would rely on when Hideyoshi marched in with his massive army. They pulled all their forces back into their fortresses, particularly Odawara Castle, which was the capital of the Hojo domain. Now before I continue, have a look at this. Nobunaga is entering the Sanada main camp. It's full of cannons, but as well as being full of cannons, it's full of explosions. And I had no idea why. You can see me checking the map here. Cannons up in the northwest over at Hojo's main camp are able to fire diagonally down a very long distance and hit my units here in the Sanada camp. And you can see I'm being absolutely torn apart by these enemy cannons. They're just destroying my formation and my troops constantly, causing massive difficulties. So this fight is going to get very bloody from now on, because between this point and the Hojo enemy commander, Ujimasa Hojo, there's going to be constant cannon fire destroying my units. Masanori in particular is going to take a massive beating. The only safe unit in fact is Ieyasu over in the east, where there's a little nook against the mountains that the cannons don't seem to be able to fire at.
Don't think this is the end of it.
So while we watch my troops getting absolutely demolished, let me tell you about what happened at Odawara Castle. As I just mentioned, Hojo had pulled all of their forces down into this massive fortress, the capital of their clan's administration, and they believed that they would be able to hold out against Hideyoshi for one reason in particular: because Hideyoshi's army was so large. They realized that the Hideyoshi force would require a massive amount of supplies to keep it in the field, which would mean in a sieging action, which could last a number of years, it would be very difficult for them to gather enough supplies to keep the troops in a fit and well state for that length of time. So Hojo's plan was to just wait out, wait for them to weaken, and perhaps they would have a chance to attack later on after Hideyoshi's force had become weak through starvation and exposure to the elements. However, they didn't count on Hideyoshi's determination to take their castle. Hideyoshi basically constructed an enormous town around Odawara Castle, which was in the shape of a ring. So the sieging forces could surround the castle and live in relative comfort meanwhile, so they would be more willing to keep this siege going for a long time. In addition to this, inside this town, they set up a number of markets and of entertainments, basically of everything the troops needed to live for a long time. Including, in some cases, especially with generals, the families of the troops themselves were brought in to live with them in this siege town. So Hideyoshi's forces basically set up for the long run. They were indeed going to be able to stay there for a very long time. Hideyoshi assigned a number of officers as logistics officers to maintain supply lines to this ringed town so that they would never have to retreat due to lack of food.
I cannot afford to die in a losing effort.
We can see here, I'm still pushing forward towards the Hojo main camp. Masanori has taken enormous damage, and now just when I didn't need it, Yukimura Sanada shows up yet again, blasting out of the Hojo camp with heavy cavalry. So I'm forced to bring forces up through the firestorm in order to attack. Meanwhile, Masamune Date has made his two subordinate units just completely flee the field and has turned over to my side. So why has that happened? Well, basically this is representing something that happened historically, which I'm about to get onto actually, so I guess I should keep telling the story. I was just saying that Hideyoshi had created this enormous town which would be able to sustain his forces, and had created a big chain of supply which would keep his forces stocked up while he was conducting the siege. So it looked like Hideyoshi was going to be able to make the siege go on for a very long time. There were a few engagements, actual combat engagements between Hojo forces and Hideyoshi forces, but they weren't decisive in any way. And here in the stage, Masanori is in massive trouble because Yukimura Sanada has just employed the most annoying skill in the game, the water wave skill, which decimates your units. And I'm forced to pull Masanori out to stop him from dying in battle. I pull him into his own unit so I can control him independently of the rest of them. But I can't retreat him either, because if he retreats, he'll be going right into the arc of fire of the cannons and be destroyed by them. So thus I'm forced to just leave him floundered on the riverbank in between the cannons and the enemy forces. Meanwhile, Masamune is fighting up the left side, eventually is going to be able to provide some sort of flanking action on the Hojo main camp. Luckily at this stage, Ieyasu and his Konoichi ninja Okatsu have come up to support me, which will give me a big numbers advantage against Yukimura Sanada, and I'll eventually be able to destroy him and start moving on enemy camp. But you can already see the casualties I've taken are very large. Nobunaga in particular, the unit which I cannot lose because I'll lose the level if he dies, has taken heavy casualties, so I'm going to have to be a little bit careful. The rest of my units, you can see their health bars are dropping fairly rapidly. Anyway, let's go back to the story, because I was about to talk about Masamune Date, and he's going to play a role in the next few minutes. During the battle, the siege, Hideyoshi had sent to the Date clan basically with a question. The question was, are you going to submit to me, or are you going to have the same treatment that we do to the Hojo clan to you? So do we have to invade you and suppress you before you'll submit to us? Now the Date clan didn't know at first how to answer. Hideyoshi had given them an offer. He basically said, if you want to support me and show that you are willing to go along with my shogunate, bring forces to the siege of Odawara castle to take part in the siege, and this will show your allegiance to me. So they put together an army and started marching towards the castle. However, they still hadn't decided whether they wanted to actually side with Hideyoshi or instead side with Hojo and then form an alliance against Hideyoshi along with the Hojo. So what they did was they camped not far from the battle site and allowed the battle to begin before they arrived, hiding some distance off. And they sent spies and ninjas forward to observe the battle, observe the siege, and see what sort of things Hideyoshi was doing. However, when the spies and ninjas saw the size and power of Hideyoshi's force, they reported back to the Date army that there was basically no way they would be able to oppose it ever. So this basically sealed the deal for Masamune, and he was forced to side with Hideyoshi, bring his forces up to help fight the Hojo. And from then on, the Date clan would basically be a vassal of Hideyoshi. They would come up with a deal after the battle as to the vassalage. Masanori found this healing point extremely useful, so now he's back to at least a reasonable number of troops and isn't on the verge of death. It's very good to avoid death, because then if they if they die, you can't really use them in the next stage because they are on the down health status, which means they can't use officer skills and their attack values are dramatically suppressed.
You should be ready to go now. I shall fight to the death.
So Date joins with Hideyoshi. Hojo is eventually forced to surrender by the siege. Ujimasa Hojo, the leader of the Hojo clan, is looking out at this massive siege town, and he realizes that Hideyoshi talks the talk as well as walking the walk, and that he is going to be a formidable opponent to break with a siege, and that his whole strategy of going down into forts and waiting out the enemy isn't going to do any good. So he decides that instead of forcing the issue, he is going to surrender. He commits suicide, sparing the lives of his 80,000 or so strong army, and the Hojo clan becomes a vassal of Hideyoshi as well. This moment marked the end of Hideyoshi's, or the main part of Hideyoshi's war in Japan, because it meant there were no longer any powerful clans that were not declaring their allegiance to Hideyoshi. So in effect, the land had been unified under Hideyoshi from this moment onwards in 1590. It wasn't the end of the Sengoku Jidai era though, because wars would continue. Hideyoshi was something of a warmongerer, and even if there weren't wars in Japan, he would create wars to fight. The main one being the war in Korea, which he decided to start. He'd been planning it for a long time, and now that Japan was unified, it was time for him to enact his plan. And perhaps I'll talk about that another time, but it was a very drawn out and eventually disastrous campaign on Hideyoshi's part to realise his dream of unifying Japan, Korea and China under a single empire, which he wished himself to rule and his dynasty to rule.
Now is our chance.
The Sengoku Jidai era would eventually end 10 years after the siege of Odawara Castle, with the Battle of Sekigahara, when Ieyasu Tokugawa would take over as the dominant leader in Japan. But there'll be time to talk about that in the future, I believe. So let's have a look at what I'm doing in this stage. I spent quite a while holding my forces back and using heal skills to at least get them a little bit more prepared for this final assault. At this stage though, I have a massive numerical advantage on the enemy in terms of active units, 3 of which are ally units. With ally units I'm not too fussed about them taking casualties, so I'm actually in a fairly good position. So I was being a little bit conservative by doing all these healings before I moved in. But I set my forces up just east of the enemy main camp. We can see the enemy cannons firing diagonally here, so my assumption that if they fired straight forwards, it was incorrect, and if I'd known before the battle, potentially I would have done things differently, but I survived despite my lack of knowledge, so it was okay. But now I need to think about getting in there and taking out these Hojo officers who are just sitting, basically ignoring me as if I haven't got this massive force about to flank them. They don't react in any way. I sent Ieyasu to basically take the vanguard by attacking the cannons nearest to the enemy forces. Meanwhile, Toshie sneaks in the back corner, taking out these enemy cannons here. I was expecting the enemy's heavy cavalry to charge me now, so I was about to set up a spear wall and try and hold them back, but they didn't seem to. So instead I have to get Toshie to sort of creep forwards, trying to get them to recognise that I'm there. Meanwhile, on the other side, Masamune is trying to break through all the cannons, and he's actually going to, for some reason, find it extremely difficult to break through the enemy's cannon line, even though they don't really pose any resistance whatsoever. So Masamune is going to prove very useless in this final assault. Finally, the enemy charge. Toshie begins his spear wall tactics. I hit some of my own troops because they rush forward into my attack, but still, Uchiteru Hojo, one of the Hojo officers, loses half his troops. Extremely good.
Prepare yourself, Nobunaga. Your head is mine.
So there he is, the man himself, Ujimasa Hojo, trying to defeat him once and for all. He's not a particularly fleshed out character in the game because Hojo don't play a big part in Nobunaga's legend, so he's just a sort of generic enemy officer at this time. I tried to keep Nobunaga back for this engagement just in case the enemy used some sort of skill that would kill him. I send the newly healed Masanori Fukushima in to do a flanking maneuver and try and attack Ujimasa Hojo himself by charging through Ieyasu's troops.
Finish them!
Although he's going to charge right into an enemy rifle tower and have to deal with that. We can see on the map that Masamune still hasn't managed to break into the enemy main camp. I don't know what he's doing over there, but he's really having trouble. And on the east side it's just a massive pell-mell of my own units all stacked on top of each other, attempting to get towards the enemy. It looks like Musashi and Ieyasu are the only ones actually in any sort of position to attack the enemy.
Let's finish them!
If only Date Masamune would show up, we would have a much easier time because we could take out the enemy's ranged units which are sitting behind them.
We must hold our ground!
Looks like Date has finally destroyed one set of cannons, and I'm going to reassign him to take out the enemy's horse archers rather than go for the rifle tower. The rifle tower is unimportant at this stage. I think I'm going to use Masanori to destroy the rifle tower. Masamune, the guy I'm frustratingly trying to get into the action, he only had one eye, as a fun fact. I think it was a birth defect if I recall correctly. He only had a single eye. He was kind of embarrassed about it though. He wasn't one to show off the fact he had one eye. He wasn't a sort of cool one-eyed pirate or anything, as he is often portrayed in Koei games actually. He was quite embarrassed. In any sort of public representations of his image, he would always demand that he be shown with two eyes so that people wouldn't know about his birth defect. You can imagine it would have been sort of embarrassing for a leader of one of the great clans to have this big problem. So he did pretty well in covering it up.
I'm going for total victory.
The Date clan, I believe, were famous
Now is our
for
chance.
the quality
Let's
of their
finish
swordsmen. I think that was their big deal. They were quite far in the north of Japan, so didn't really play a role in any of the big politics.
We must
They were even
hold
further
our
away from the
ground.
capital than Uesugi, and Uesugi never really even came close to getting to the capital, which means for the Date clan it was even more difficult to actually have an influence on Japanese politics. I send Masanori off to defeat the enemy horse archers, getting frustrated in the end, but the battle ends before I can, so oh well. Means I'll lose a few
fall
points in the
apart
end,
so easily.
but I believe I actually get 100 for enemies killed anyway, so it turns out you didn't have to defeat all the enemies to get the maximum score on this stage, which is pretty nice of them.
The battle is over. Everybody, you fought well.
So as I said, that was, in my opinion, one of the hardest stages in the game so far, probably the hardest stage in the game so far. I took massive losses and almost lost Masanori, which would have been my second ever loss, I believe, in this campaign. But still, managed to get the S ranking, so I'm still going to get the exciting selection of prizes. We have the Issei mounted rifles, not very useful since I don't really ever intend to use mounted rifle units. The thick Yukishita armor, this is what Yukimura Sanada was wearing, I believe. I think it looks quite good. Wugo and ninja weapon, might use that. And the Mount Fuji helmet, which is great. I guess it looks like a mountain. It kind of looks a little bit like some sort of ray, I don't know. And this really cool tree ties, which gives you some very good skills, and a bow unit. Potentially useful. I only have one bow unit that I use, which is Nagihide, and he, I think, already has the best bow you can get. So I don't think any more bow units are going to be very useful. Tons of skill levels up, which was very good. Nobunaga didn't even get a level up though, so despite it being a really hard battle, no reward for Nobunaga.
This land will be mine.
My lord, we've just received word. Lord Nobunaga has taken Gifu.
Lord Nobunaga? He's still alive? But I've already started. How can I stop now?
So it looks like Ieyasu is a little bit frustrated that Nobunaga was still alive, but he's still loyal, and he decides to follow him until the end, rather than going against him.
Alright. What's our first move?
So now we are back to the strategy map.
My lord, here's the situation.
Let's have a little look at the situation. You can tell from the general lack of cutscenes that we have not moved on to a decisive battle this chapter. I still have to do the one remaining normal battle, which is unlike a lot of the other chapters. It doesn't make you skip over it. So next week we're going to be saying the last normal battle in chapter 11, and then perhaps the week after that we'll see the decisive battle and moving on to chapter 12. This battle is Onotsu against the Muri and Ishiki army. Ishiki is one of the vassals of the shogunate, so basically you're going to be facing Yoshiaki's forces along with the Mori. This battle will be the one in which we rescue Hideyoshi and Koroku, two more of my greatest officers, so if I can get them back on board after getting Katsuie and Toshie back on board last week, my army will be back up to full strength and ready to face chapter 12 with whatever it throws at me. Until then, I'll just add one more thing about the fall of Hojo, which was that there's a kind of poeticness to the fact that they fell at this stage in history, I think, because they were one of the first clans to rebel against the Ashikaga shogunate. They were the first clans to end the peace, and yet at the same time they were the last clan surviving against the new shogunate. So they were a clan very much independent from the rest of the ruling shogunate. Although you could also say that about the Shimazu clan, which was the clan in the far, far west of Japan, in Kyushu Island, southwest Kyushu Island to be specific, who never really paid any attention to what was going on in the rest of Japan. They just did their own thing, and no one really cared, to be honest, because they were so far away and not particularly interesting and relatively unfertile land. But they were very militarily powerful, and Hideyoshi would conquer them before the siege of Odawara and would use their strength during the Korean War, which perhaps, as I said, I'll have a chance to talk about later. But until then, I'll wish you a very good week, and I'll see you next time on The Legend of Nobunaga.